Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture for Unit 7. This is Section 2, The Age of Progress and Modernity. We are going to be looking at scientific and intellectual advances in the period of 1850 to 1914. So the theme for today's lecture is technological and scientific innovation, and you will see why that is shortly. And we have two objectives that you'll need to focus on for your write-up. The first objective is to explain how science and other intellectual disciplines developed and changed throughout the period of 1850 to 1914. And the second objective, which you'll include in the overall write-up, is to explain how Darwin's theories influenced scientific and social developments from 1850 to 1914. The reason that second objective is there is because the AP really wants to make sure that you understand Darwin and social Darwinism and his theories and the effects that they have on European society, which we'll touch upon in this lecture, but we will continue to see the effects of these really significant theories in future lectures in Unit 7 as well. So after 1850, as we move towards the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Europe is really entering a new age of science. And this is strongly influenced by the new focus on realism, right? Think about the politics of reality. And in a later lecture, we'll see how realism also affects art. But this idea of realism and secularization as well are going to place new emphasis on scientific development. So scientific ideas and methods enjoyed huge popularity and prestige in the public mind of Europe after 1850. As I mentioned, the growth of scientific knowledge reflected the realism and the progress of the age. Secularization also supported the growth of science, especially scientific support from national governments, which was more common on the continent of Europe. As a result, scientific knowledge grew rapidly, and research promoted and appreciated science for its practical application to industrial technology. So that should remind you of the fact that science is associated with profit, right? If science can improve technology and technology can improve efficiency and therefore improve profit, this is one of the many reasons science has always been embraced by the upper classes of Europe since the scientific revolution. Science became so important that to many scientists and people interested in this field, science became almost a religion for them. And this is the term we use to describe this sort of religion of science is called positivism. Positivism. And we will talk more specifically about that in a little bit. Now, the first major scientist of note is Louis Pasteur. And Louis Pasteur is famous because he essentially discovered germ theory, which is hugely influential in medical science. Louis Pasteur was a French chemist who approached medical problems in a scientific fashion. And he actually discovered that there were these microorganisms, which we usually call germs, that caused disease and caused food spoilage. This is what would lead to what is sometimes called the bacterial revolution. And the discovery of germ theory and this bacterial revolution is very significant in reducing the overall mortality rate in Europe. So in 1863, Louis Pasteur developed the process of pasteurization. Hopefully you already maybe made that connection. Pasteurization is a process in which heating a product helps to destroy the organisms causing spoilage. We primarily apply pasteurization to milk and maybe juice or other products like that. But Louis Pasteur actually developed this to prevent beer from spoiling. And one of our enrichment videos is actually goes into more detail about that. If you look at the diagram in the upper right corner of your screen, it gives you an idea of the pasteurization process. When milk is comes out of a cow, this is considered like the raw form of milk. It then goes through a heating process in that red square, right? And that burns off a lot of the bacteria that would cause spoilage. And then it goes through a cooling process in the blue square. And this process of pasteurization really helped to reduce food spoilage and therefore food poisoning. It made food more widely available for people, and of course, this also contributed to reducing the mortality rate. In addition to developing pasteurization, Louis Pasteur also developed the first preventative vaccine against rabies. So in 1885, Pasteur developed a vaccination against the disease that we know as rabies. Um, and this is a huge breakthrough in what is called immunological science. Immunological is spelled IMMUNOLOGICAL, immunological science. And once Louis Pasteur had made this breakthrough, the 1980s saw an expansion of immunological science as the principle of vaccination was extended to include diseases such as diphtheria, typhoid fever, cholera, and even the plague. Now, another important scientist is Joseph Lister, who developed the antiseptic principle. And this was developed from Louis Pasteur's discoveries in microbiology with germ theory. So Joseph Lister would use carbolic acid to eliminate infections during surgery. He essentially developed the antiseptic or the sterilization principle. So the sterilization and the cleaning of wounds is very, very important for preventing infection. If you've ever fallen down and scraped your knee, probably you need to wash it and you need to clean it out with maybe some Neosporin or something like that. And then you can put Band-Aids on it. So this is another huge breakthrough in medical science. It completely transformed surgery. Patients did not die from infections as frequently. In fact, those infections had been called hospital gangrene because it was so common for patients to die of infection after surgery. And so as a result, Joseph Lister is known as the father of modern surgery. While Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister are very influential in the development of early medical science, there were also other significant healthcare developments. The bacterial discoveries of these two men led to greater emphasis on preventative measures, such as the pasteurization of milk, improved purification of water supplies, and of course, vaccines and immunizations, which we discussed a moment ago. Also, new medical schools developed specifically to train doctors, and the profession of doctors became more formalized with professional organizations and standardized exams that doctors had to pass. And so medical science became an increasingly important and prestigious field in Western culture. And of course, overall, these developments would significantly contribute to a decline in the mortality rate as we get into the later 19th and early 20th century. Moving on now to developments in physics. So the late 19th and early 20th century also saw the development of new theories in physics. Which ultimately challenged the old theories based on Isaac Newton and his concept of the world machine. So before we discuss the new theories, let's review what Isaac Newton's world machine encompassed. So Isaac Newton had a mechanical conception of the universe, meaning he thought of the universe as this giant machine in which time and space and matter were objective realities that existed independently of the people observing them. So essentially, think of the universe and the laws that govern the motion of the planets as all being one reliable, predictable machine. And so this also encouraged a science that was based on hard facts and controlled experiments and natural and unchanging laws, things that were reliable, they made sense, and this was also to some extent comforting to Western civilization and those scientists. Well, all that is going to change with new developments in physics and other important scientific theories, starting with Max Planck. So, Max Planck was a scientist who developed quantum mechanics. And this is one of the two really big, significant discoveries in physics in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, quantum mechanics is essentially when subatomic energy is emitted in uneven little spurts called quanta, and not in a steady stream as previously thought. So, subatomic energy is emitted in uneven little spurts called quanta, and not in a steady stream as previously thought. So, this is significant because it implies that the laws governing the universe now seemed unpredictable at the atomic level. Therefore, matter and energy might be different forms of the same thing, as opposed to different things as previously thought. And this actually shook the foundations of 19th century physics that had viewed atoms as the stable, indestructible building blocks of matter. And then we have Marie Curie. So Marie Curie and her husband Pierre Curie discovered radioactivity. They discovered the first radioactive element, which is called radium, in 1910, which allowed them to develop the theory of radioactivity, which, as we know, is used extensively in 20th century scientific developments, with everything from X-rays to nuclear bombs. Marie Curie is one of the most famous female scientists ever. She won the Nobel Prize twice, once in physics and once in chemistry. However, her experimentation with radium and her practice with radioactivity in a lab made her own body so radioactive that she is actually now entombed in a lead coffin to control the emission of that radioactivity. And if you want to study her manuscripts, you also have to wear radioactive protective gear, or gear that protects you from radioactivity. So huge, significant developments from Marie Curie. And then last for this slide, we have Albert Einstein, who was arguably probably the most famous of these scientists. And Albert Einstein is famous for discovering the theory of relativity. He was a German theoretical physicist that moved to the United States when Germany started to have more political problems. And in 1905, he established the theory of relativity, of time and space, and this challenged all those traditional ideas of Newtonian physics and the idea that the universe is this sort of mechanical, reliable contraption. So essentially, the theory of relativity is the belief that time and space are relative to the viewpoint of the observer, and the only speed of light and only the speed of light is constant for all frames of reference in the universe. Right? So instead of everything being objective, everything is subjective. Everything is relative to the viewpoint of the observer. And so this dramatically undermines that idea of Newton's world machine in a predictable, mechanical, reliable universe. In addition to quantum mechanics, the theory of relativity is one of the two pillars of modern physics. And this theory unified an apparent infinite universe with the incredibly small, fast-moving subatomic world. So it connects the sort of astrophysics of Newton with the atomic level physics of Max Planck and Marie Curie. And of course, the theory of relativity is demonstrated by the famous equation E equals mc squared, which essentially means that matter and energy are interchangeable. Even a single particle of matter contains enormous levels of potential energy. So, what are the implications of this? Why is the theory of relativity such a big deal? Well, it implied that everything in the universe, everything in our life is now relative, meaning that science could no longer provide solid, indisputable answers, that science was no longer defined by hard facts and controlled experiments. And this was actually very disconcerting to many people, right? Science was always viewed as something reliable, that was always true no matter what. And now science also was relative. Science was flexible, right? And so this will contribute to a growing sense of anxiety that we will start to see emerge in European culture. These theories also led to the atomic age of the 1920s, which in some ways is considered to be the heroic age of physics, which with enormous discoveries, but these are also theories and discoveries that would lead to the creation of the nuclear bomb, and the most destructive weapons ever created by mankind. Ultimately, the development of these new theories in physics forced humans to revise some of their most cherished beliefs, and it led to industrial and military applications that affected every aspect of human life. And moving on now to our last section, we're going to have two slides on this. We're looking at modern consciousness and challenging traditions. So, specifically, we're going to be looking more at sociology, philosophy, and psychology in these next two slides. So, the first intellectual figure we're going to discuss is Auguste Comte. And Auguste Comte is the father of sociology and essentially is the founder of positivism. And you may have heard me mention this term earlier in the lecture. Positivism is this idea that all intellectual activity progresses through predictable stages. Thus, humans would soon discover the eternal laws of human relations through the study of sociology. That sounds very complex. So the short way of thinking about this is almost science as a religion, or scientific study, even if it's to other social sciences, as a form of religion. So Comte believed that social scientists, such as himself, could help regulate society for the benefit of most everyone. And Comte became the leader in this religion of science and the desire for leadership by experts, which is also what positivism supported. Positivism valued science and scientific developments, both in hard science and social science, and wanted to rely on experts for information and leadership. Now, one of the most significant intellectuals of this period is Charles Darwin, who you have likely heard about before. Charles Darwin is responsible for the theory of evolution. He was a British scientist who worked as a naturalist. A naturalist is basically another term for biologist. He worked as a naturalist for the Royal Navy, and he traveled extensively around the world to South America and to the South Pacific on his famous boat, the HMS Beagle. And through his travels, he was able to observe animals on islands virtually untouched, islands such as the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. And this is where he developed his theory of evolution. The theory of evolution basically argues that all life in the world had gradually evolved from a common ancestral origin in an unending struggle for survival, and that the species that were most able to adapt survived, right? So this idea that humans evolved from earlier forms of primates, as you can see on this graphic in the upper right corner of your screen. That's the basic idea. And even going farther back to that, the idea that mammals emerged from one specific species, and mammals and reptiles and all life emerged from other smaller organisms. So the theory of evolution was published in his book On the Origin of the Species, which was released in 1859. He followed this up with another book called The Descent of Man, published in 1871. And it was in this book that he applied the theory of evolution to human beings, arguing that humans evolved from earlier forms of primates. Now, his views were highly controversial because they essentially eliminated purpose and design from the universe. And of course, these ideas went against the Christian origin story from the book of Genesis. The theory of evolution is still considered controversial in some regions of the world today, especially regions that tend to have more fundamentalist and very orthodox Christian beliefs. But the theory of evolution has gained more support over the decades, and in the 19th century, Thomas Huxley was one of Darwin's biggest supporters. He was actually nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog, and he was another scientist who defended Darwin at every opportunity. Now, Darwin's ideas were only applied to biology. However, his ideas would be perverted and applied in a different way to human society. And so Herbert Spencer, an Englishman with lots of German connection, developed the theory of social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is essentially the theories of Darwin, but applied to human society in an inappropriate and ultimately inaccurate way. So it was Spencer, not Darwin, who created this theory of survival of the fittest. The idea that progress came from the struggle for survival. And in human civilization, this suggests that the state should not intervene in this natural process. And think about that for a moment. If humans are engaged in this survival of the fittest and progress came from the struggle for survival, this argument is actually very anti-socialist, right? So it's used to justify anti-socialist policies. It is also going to be used by imperialists to justify the conquest of weaker peoples in Africa and Asia. And we'll see many examples of that when we get to imperialism later in this unit. Social Darwinism was also used by major industrialists to justify their wealth while so many other people struggled for subsistence. And this idea of social Darwinism was particularly popular among the upper middle class. Ultimately, social Darwinism would lead to extreme racism and nationalism, as the theory suggested that nations and races were also engaged in this so-called struggle for existence. It contributed to the rise of extreme German nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially the concept of the racial superiority of the Aryan race, Aryan. Germans believed that they were members of the Aryan race, who were the true and original creators of Western culture. And ultimately, this extreme German nationalism and social Darwinism could be used to advocate for the destruction of lower or lesser races, such as Jews or Africans or Asians, people of other races. And of course, we will see how that turns out when we learn about the rise of the Nazis and World War II and the Holocaust. Moving on to our last slide here, we're going to talk about two more important thinkers, Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Nietzsche. So Sigmund Freud is considered one of the three intellectual giants of the 19th century. The other two are Charles Darwin and Karl Marx. And Sigmund Freud is responsible for developing the field of modern psychology. Now, traditional psychology, as much as it had existed before Freud, assumed a single unified conscious mind that processed sensory experiences in a rational and logical way. basically the psychology that existed before Freud emphasized the rationalism and the logic of the Enlightenment. But in contrast to that rationalism of the Enlightenment, Freud believed that humans were actually largely irrational in their habits. And Freud's discoveries and theories actually undermined the optimism about the irrational nature of the human mind. So we'll see that both Freud and Nietzsche emphasize and celebrate the irrational, which is, of course, a big cultural change from the emphasis on rationality that had really dominated culture since the Enlightenment. So let's dive into some of Freud's theories here. So Freud asserted that because the human unconsciousness, which is known as the id, that because the id is driven by sexual, aggressive, and pleasure-seeking desires, humans are therefore not rational and as in control of themselves as many liked to believe. So this also leads to one of Freud's most famous theories, the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. So Freud believed that humans had different levels of consciousness, and that our deepest level, basically our subconscious, was called the id. And the id controlled our basic instincts, desire for sex, desire for food, desire for safety, and the real primal needs of a human. And the id, therefore, was in constant battle with other areas of the brain. The next level beyond the id is called the ego. And the ego is considered to be the rationalizing consciousness, right? The awareness of reality, which ultimately mediates what a person can do. So the id is what you need or want to do, and the ego is what you can do. The ego tells you what you can do. All right, then the highest level of consciousness there is the superego. And the superego is aware of social morals and obligations. It essentially determines what a person should do, right? What a person should do. So the ego is what you want or you need. The id is what you want or need. The ego is what you can do, and the superego is what you should do. And Freud believed that all human behavior was strongly determined by these levels of consciousness and the battles they had with each other. Freud also emphasized that sexuality was a key driving force in a person's psychological makeup. He argued that repressed sexual desires would lead to psychological problems if not addressed. Now, the theory of the id, ego, and the superego, and some of his other crazy theories, especially rooted in sexuality, like the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex, oral and anal retention, all of those are essentially seen as inaccurate theories, right? They're not things that are considered to be true in the field of psychology. However, Freud's lasting impact, the reason he is so important as an intellectual in the 19th century, is because he is essentially the founder of psychoanalysis, which is the primary investigative tool and form of therapy used in the field of psychology. So, for example, he believed that the hysteria of his patients, who were mostly women, originated in unhappy early childhood experiences where they had repressed strong feelings. And using hypnosis or allowing the patient to sort of speak freely and have free association of their thoughts or ideas, Freud was able to help the patient understand his or her unhappiness and how to deal with it. So again, this is the important and legitimate foundation of psychoanalysis, which is the bedrock of psychology. Now, Freud's theories began to enjoy international popularity in the early 20th century, especially by 1910. But not all of this popularity was appropriately interpreted. For example, many people believed that Freud's theories suggested that the first requirement for mental health is an uninhibited and active sex life. And there is a popular interpretation that Freud actually encouraged sexual experimentation, which I don't believe is necessarily true. But regardless, Freud undermined that old optimism about the rational and progressive nature of the human mind. He also established psychoanalysis. He established the role of the unconscious in human behavior, the concept of therapy. All these ideas are still relevant and very important to the field of psychology, modern psychology. And overall, these Freudian concepts helped to shape the developing fields of human behavior, which are the early fields of social science, things like psychology and sociology and things like that. And Freud, like Nietzsche, is an intellectual who challenges the dominance of rationality, calls into question just how rational human behavior actually is, and suggests that humans are much more irrational than previously thought. So that brings us to our last intellectual of the period, and that is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche is the photo on the top right here, the one who looks like he massacred a squirrel and then stapled the tail to his face. And Sigmund Freud is the guy in the suit smoking cigar on the bottom right. So Nietzsche was a German philosopher, a professor of classical languages, very well educated man, but he then suffered a complete mental collapse at the age of 45 and spent the rest of his life in an asylum. He is one of the most important critics of the rationalism of the Enlightenment, much like Freud. And he glorified the irrational. Basically, he believed that the West had overemphasized rationality and as a result stifled the passion and animal instincts that drive human activity and creativity. So again, he believes that rationality has inhibited creativity and activity. Very specifically, this is seen as a rejection of sort of the bourgeois morality and values that came to define much of 19th century culture. Nietzsche has some concepts that he's very famous for, some controversial concepts. In 1885, he published a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra. You don't need to write that down. And in this book, he blasted religion and famously claimed that, quote, God is dead. Now, of course, that's a very provocative statement. God is dead. What do you think that means? Well, Nietzsche claimed that Christianity embodied what he called a, quote, slave morality, which glorified weakness, envy, and ultimately mediocrity. All right, so he believed that Christianity was a slave morality and that God was dead. And so take some time to think about that and question what that might mean in these circumstances and context of the 19th century. Now, I don't want you to think that he only hated Christianity. He hated all religions equally and believed that they all emphasize this idea of a slave morality. He also believed that individualism had been crushed by society, which imposed uniformity on the masses. In fact, he lived and wrote much of these philosophies during an age that we call the Age of Mass Society, which we'll discuss later in this unit. He also attacked most modern concepts, things like democracy, Western concepts of freedom, Western morality, nationalism, anti Semitism. And in 1888, he published another book called Will to Power, in which he wrote that that only the creativity of a few supermen, in German this is called Übermenschen, that only a few supermen could successfully reorder the world, right? That there would be a select few of incredibly intelligent and talented men who were able to rise above the slave morality of Christianity and the uniformity of the masses and have the bravery and the intellect to reorder the world. Now, these ideas, specifically of the Übermenschen, would become very influential to individuals like Hitler and his Nazi ideology, which is not what Nietzsche would have supported. So Nietzsche and Freud agreed that these mechanisms of rational thinking and traditional moral values could actually be too strong on the human psyche. And so Nietzsche and Freud are considered to be really important philosophers in establishing the emphasis on irrationality as it dictates human behavior and human thought. And they're also very influential in the development of this cultural period we will study later on called the Age of Anxiety, which sort of precedes and then follows World War I. But more on that later. Let's wrap this up by taking a moment to discuss what the overall impact of these new theories were on Europe as a whole. So, Darwinism, as we mentioned, further challenged the Bible's account of the creation of humans, and it challenged a lot of Christian morality and therefore caused a lot of controversy. Freudian psychology undermined the belief that humans were rational beings in control of their emotions. And when we look at the impact of the new physics, right, those ideas by Einstein and Planck, the new physics shattered the popular belief that the universe could be easily explained via Newtonian physics, right? It shattered that idea of the world machine and a reliable mechanical conception of the universe. It challenged these long held ideas since Newton that all particles interacted based on gravitational force. So it introduces a whole new understanding of the world and the universe. And Einstein's theory of relativity now theorized that universal laws were relative, right? They were based on the position of the observer. So that undermines the reliability of hard facts and controlled experiments that tended to define science. And scientists realized that they knew less about the universe than previously thought. And so this uncertainty and this emphasis on irrationality and all these new ideas that are undermining beliefs that they thought to be so true and irrefutable, this uncertainty later fed the pessimism and the anxiety of European society in the wake of World War I. And we will see that the ideas of, say, Freud and Nietzsche and Einstein continue to be influential in the years leading up to World War I and in the years following World War I. But that's another story for another day. Thank you for listening today, and stay tuned for lecture 7.3.